So imagine this. The United States announces a massive military operation right in the middle of a major conflict, aiming to secure the Strait of Hormuz. That's literally the world's most critical energy choke point. You'd think global markets would send shockwaves everywhere, right? But they barely flinched. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack this wild announcement that left oil markets completely unfazed. Let's dive into the hard data and figure out exactly why traders just shrugged off this historic military move. To really get a sense of the scale here, we got to look at President Trump's Project Freedom. The whole point of this operation is to help free up stranded vessels in the Gulf. And Central Command is not messing around. They're talking about deploying 15,000 service members. Add to that over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, guided missile destroyers, and all these multi-domain unmanned platforms. On paper, it's an absolute powerhouse of a move. A massive, highly resourced operation meant to project power and get this critical global waterway back in order. But here is the crazy part. Negative 0.06%. Yeah, after that huge announcement, July Brent crude futures, which is the big international benchmark for oil, basically just flatlined, settling right at $108.11. The market's reaction was, well, practically nothing. A totally negligible drop. It's like traders looked at this plan and saw zero hope that it would actually fix what's turned into the biggest energy disruption in history. So the big question for us is why? Why did the market completely ignore this?
Section 1. Decoding Project Freedom. Okay, when you break down the actual specifics of this military op, the market's total lack of reaction suddenly makes a lot of sense. The administration's stated mission on Sunday sounded broad enough. Help free up vessels stranded in the Gulf starting on Monday. But traders immediately zeroed in on a glaring omission. There was absolutely zero mention of direct U.S. Navy escorts for these commercial ships. And that is a huge deal, because earlier proposals for naval escorts had already been shot down by officials who said, they just needed more time to prepare for something like that. Central Command even put out a statement saying they would support transiting vessels, but they deliberately stopped short of promising escorts. So, the market basically looked at that and realized, hey, without escorts, the actual physical risk to these ships hasn't changed one bit.
Section 2. Tension in the Strait.
Right now, the reality out on the water is moving at this breakneck, incredibly fragile pace. Let's look at the timeline. Back in late February, the U.S.-Israel war on Iran kicked off. Flash forward to April 7th, and the sides actually managed to agree on a fragile ceasefire. Fast forward to Sunday, and the U.S. announces Project Freedom to assist ships. But almost immediately, by Monday, new vessel attacks are already popping up in the news. Seeing it laid out chronologically like this really shows us that despite a nominal truce, and despite this massive new military announcement, the physical threat out there wasn't de-escalating at all. If anything, things were actively flaring right back up. And a geopolitical pushback? It was instantaneous. Ibrahim Azizi, over at the Iranian Parliament's National Security Commission, came right out and stated that any American interference in the Strait would be considered a direct breach of that April 7th truce. Senior Iranian officials were very explicit, signaling they absolutely refused to cooperate with the U.S. plan. So to the oil markets, this was a massive red flag. It meant Project Freedom wasn't just going to fail to smooth things over. It actually carried the very real risk of completely shattering the fragile ceasefire they had just put in place.
Sadly, the market's fears were validated almost instantly. Monday's reports from the UK maritime trade operations came in, and they were intense. A tanker off the coast of the UAE was physically struck by what they called unknown projectiles. And just hours before that, a bulk carrier reported being attacked by a bunch of small craft off the coast of Iran. Now, the good news is that 0 crew members were harmed in either of those incidents. But the reality is, these facts just hammer home the active physical danger out there. A big military announcement on a podium simply isn't going to move oil prices if commercial ships are literally still getting hit by projectiles.
Section 3. The Global Supply Shock.
We really need to talk about the stakes here, because they are just enormous. The Strait of Hormuz normally handles 1/5 of the entire world's oil supplies. Think about that. 20% of all global oil relies on this single, narrow, little waterway to get where it needs to go. So when threats start shutting down maritime traffic here, we're not just looking at some regional issue. We are looking at a critical artery of the entire global economy being pinched shut.
To really wrap our heads around the severity of that pinch, let's look at the numbers. Before the war started in late February, the UN Trade and Development Agency reported the Strait was seeing an average of 129 daily transits. 129! But now, according to recent tracking data from the maritime intelligence platform Windward, that number has just plummeted to a mere 20 vessels crossing the Strait in a single day.
The threat of conflict has literally crippled maritime traffic, reducing it to a tiny fraction of what we see in peacetime.
And that brings us to the absolute crux of this physical shortage, 14.5 million. According to estimates from Goldman Sachs, that is the staggering number of barrels of daily global oil production that are currently just missing. Between the effective closure of the waterway and all those targeted attacks on energy infrastructure, the world is down 14.5 million barrels every single day. That is a massive chunk of supply. And honestly, that's the reality the oil markets are trading on. They aren't looking at political speeches, they're looking at millions of missing barrels.
Section 4. The long road ahead.
This whole dynamic is summed up perfectly by June Go, a senior oil market analyst at Sparta over in Singapore. She pointed out that global observable oil inventories are starting to fall sharply, which should weigh on market sentiment more than political statements. She's saying that getting the flow back to normal is going to take way more than what Project Freedom is putting on the table, and that this yawning gap in oil supply, it's going to take months to sort out. This expert analysis totally backs up the core premise of our explainer today. The actual physical drop in global energy supply matters so much more to the market than broad military maneuvers.
You know, even if Washington and Tehran were to magically sign a solid peace agreement tomorrow, analysts are warning that prices are going to stay high. Brent crude is already up nearly 50% since the war started and has been sitting above $100 a barrel for weeks now. Why? Well, because the industry is staring down an absolute logistical nightmare. They've got this massive backlog of unloaded energy supplies, they've got heavily damaged energy infrastructure that desperately needs repairing, and maybe most critically, there's the highly dangerous, super time-consuming need to clear out Iranian mines from the waterway itself. You just can't flip a switch and go back to normal.
Which leaves us with this final really big question to chew on. Will the Iran war reshape the global energy order entirely? I mean, when a single choke point can instantly wipe 14.5 million barrels off the daily market, and traders just totally shrug off the announcement of 15,000 U.S. troops, you kind of have to wonder if the global economy is going to start permanently restructuring how it gets its power. Well, I really hope this explainer gave you a solid, structured look at exactly what's driving the numbers behind all the news lately. Thanks so much for learning with us today, and remember, keep asking those big questions.